Hello and welcome to another video. Some questions have been on my mind lately as I think about all the advice out there for parents of gender questioning children. And specifically, I'm going to be sharing some principles today for those of you who have pre-pubertal children. And after preparing this video, I realized that, of course, many of these principles are perfectly applicable to adult children and teens too, as you'll see. But some of the specifics we're going to discuss today are of particular relevance to parents with younger children. Unlike teens and young adults, children under the age of 11 are much less peer-focused, and they're still explicitly looking to their parents and to adults to get them oriented to the world around them and to help them understand themselves. So then, what is the role a parent should play here? So some questions on my mind include, what amount of gender fantasy and play should a prepubertal children engage in before parents step in and try to explain reality? Is there such a thing as too much parental direction at this age? Can young children become confused about their bodies and their biological sex by being exposed to a health ed curriculum that teaches gender identity, for example? What does the involvement of a gender clinic likely mean for the trajectory of a young dysphoric child? What impact does social transition have on the chances that your child will later become medicalized in the future? In my last two videos, I also outlined some principles for parenting gender questioning kids. In September, we focused on adult children, and in October, we talked about teens. So today, we'll turn our focus to a group of children who have really unique needs, given their age, their development, and their dependence on parents to orient them to the realities of the world. Before I share these principles with you, I'd like to ask that if you're here on YouTube, please subscribe if you like this kind of information, and be sure to like this particular video if you'd like to see more of this kind of thing in the future. I'll also include links and helpful references in the video description below. So let's get started. Principle number 1, learn the facts. You need to understand the desistance rates. The 12 follow-up studies that we have on children with childhood onset gender dysphoria show that 60 to 90% of them desist from a trans identity by adulthood and return to identifying with their natal birth sex. In other words, trans identity is not innate or fixed, so medicalizing it is actually highly questionable. Also, the evidence supporting social and medical transition has been found either to be very weak or non-existent, and the risks are largely unknown. Risks we do know about puberty blockers is that they cause issues with bone density, they halt sexual development, and they cause fertility issues. So puberty blockers are not a pause button. In fact, in almost 99% of cases where children are given puberty blockers, they go on to take cross-sex hormones. So we can actually say puberty blockers are more like a start button towards a lifelong medical process. And when followed by cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers leave children sterile, and that is not reversible. Following several systematic reviews of the evidence, European countries like the UK, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark have either completely stopped or dramatically restricted the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors, opting instead for psychological support as the first line of treatment. So you should learn more about the Dutch protocol. This is the informal name given to the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, which was first studied in a small cohort of 55 children in the Netherlands in the early 2000s. I'll include links for that below. And for more medical information, I highly recommend visiting SEGEM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, and GenSpect, which I'll also link. Principle number 2, find the right school environment. A school should really be taking cues from parents about how to handle mental health and identity issues in their students. For example, on our podcast, Gender a Wider Lens, we spoke with Alex Capo, who's the director of the Charlton School in New York. And Alex told us about how parents at his school helped him and the other staff to understand that gender identity issues were beginning to overshadow and distract from the real core needs of the students there. So the school changed their policies and saw a huge improvement in the students' mental health, and they even saw a wave of desistance. So, do you know your school's policy on keeping secrets from parents? Do you know if your child's school develops gender support plans with students without telling their parents? And what are your children learning about in their health ed curriculum? I'm going to show you a couple of diagrams here. The genderbread person and the gender unicorn are examples of diagrams used in a lot of health ed curriculums that teach explicitly wrong, non-scientific concepts about biological sex and about how people form identities. These ideas can be deeply confusing and create serious distress and misunderstanding for students. We're going to keep talking about cognitive development a little bit more later on in this video. But for now, it's crucial that you get involved with your school to understand their policies and practices involving parents on issues related to students' mental health, their identity, bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, etc. So if your child is being affirmed and treated as the opposite sex by their school, by other students, and especially by adults, teachers, and staff, this likely makes it harder for your child to desist, to make peace with his or her body, and to return to identifying with their birth sex. So a question I encourage parents to ask themselves is this environment conducive to my child desisting? Principle number 3, affirm reality for your child using age-appropriate concepts. Confusing messages about sex and gender aside, all children are limited in their comprehension based on their age and stage of cognitive development. So before the age of 4, children typically rely just on their senses and their perception to understand the world around them. And between ages 4 and 7, children begin to develop more logical abilities in addition to using their immediate perceptions. I want to talk about something called sex constancy. Between the ages of 4 and 7, this is a cognitive capacity that develops, which helps children to understand that changing characteristics associated with sex can't actually change sex. So, for example, if you have a classroom of children in this age group, prior to developing sex constancy, a little boy wearing a wig and a dress, other students might think that he's actually become biologically female, that he's become a girl. But once children develop this concept of sex constancy, they'll be able to recognize that a little boy wearing a dress and a wig is still a little boy wearing a dress and a wig. So when a child is looking to parents and adults for guidance, it's crucial that we not lie to them about important matters. Now, that's not to say that it isn't really wonderful and important to play make-believe with a child and help them express their imagination and creativity and fantasy, but these are games that come to an end and we place limits around them. When parents and adults erect boundaries around fantasy play, it helps to give the children a distinguishing factor between what's real and what's just imagination. Children really need to understand their bodies. They also need to understand what their emotions could mean and what is true and not true. When these things become distorted or glossed over or turned into vague euphemisms, like we saw with the genderbread person and the gender unicorn, this is deeply unfair to the child and can lead to problems. Which brings us to the next principle. Principle number 4, understand the relationship between social and medical transition. Children will believe what we tell them about their bodies and their identities. If you tell a little girl that she can become a boy, or if you tell a little boy that he can become a girl, they will believe you. Furthermore, if a prepubertal child is being raised as though they are the opposite sex, it makes impending puberty a real crisis rather than a developmentally normal necessary stage of growth. Chloe Cole is a detransitioner who spoke to us at the GenSpect conference in Denver about how her social transition and the use of puberty blockers led directly into further medicalization. I think she called it a pipeline, which makes perfect sense. So when you are trying to get out of distress and you follow the gender pathway, this means continuing to move forward on that pathway and starting with a social transition and then getting everyone's buy-in and making these outward visible changes to your presentation and your identity can lead directly into hormonal intervention, ultimately making it about more and more medicalization. Principle number 5, talk to your child about the reality of his or her body using factual, clear information. For example, don't say, you have a boy body. Say, you are a boy, and explain what that means, given that puberty is right around the corner. Puberty is going to bring along the following changes, and be clear and factual with the words you use. If you have a gender non-conforming child, normalize and celebrate their behavior and their preferences while validating their biological sex. For example, you are a boy who really likes to dance, play dress up, and spend time with your friends who are girls. That's okay. You're a creative and expressive person, and that doesn't make you any less of a boy. Principle number 6, help your child develop resilience because puberty is coming. We know that toddlers and young kids look to parents to help them gauge how they should feel or respond when something happens. This is called social referencing. So the simplest, most obvious example is when a toddler is playing and falls, he or she will look to the adults or the parents in the room to get a sense of how seriously he should take it. So if the parents automatically start panicking and freaking out and worrying, the child is going to get the message that this was a big deal and I should be upset. On the other hand, if the parents are warm and calm and loving, but treat the fall like it's not a big deal, the child will learn that he or she is okay and he can keep playing. So children also need this kind of help to develop bravery and resilience if they're feeling uncomfortable with their bodies or if they're scared of the changes that are coming along with puberty. So you can explain that there are things about puberty that will be unpleasant and other things that will actually be pleasant, and that it's normal for it to be a really confusing time. You can also instill confidence in your child by reinforcing that they are capable, resilient, and strong, and they can get through difficult things. In the notes, I'll also include some books which you can use to help talk to your child about the changes that are coming with puberty. I've tried to select books that don't confuse kids about their bodies with jargon about gender identity. But be sure to look through any resources first for yourself to make sure that they teach clear, straightforward facts about boys' and girls' bodies. Principle 7, accept your child's distress. In order to show faith in your child's ability to face and overcome difficulties, you also have to accept that they will be experiencing some distress. Many parents that I've worked with are very warm and loving with their children and also feel their kids' pain so strongly that it's difficult to accept that distress is an inevitable and normal part of their kid's life. It's valuable to develop your own attitude of acceptance and practice modeling a kind of calm, confident way of handling your child's distress as well as your own. Principle number 8, be very cautious with gender clinics and gender therapists. One would imagine that the designation of a gender therapist or gender clinic would imply a great deal of expertise, in-depth knowledge, and the delivery of the absolute highest quality of evidence-based care. Unfortunately, this is not what gender therapy and gender medicine has necessarily become, especially not here in the US. The most radical versions of gender care, which is hardly care at all, are grounded in new, untested, and really incomplete ideas about child development. So here's the concept in a nutshell. Everyone has a gender identity, and people who are uncomfortable with their biological sex and want to be a different sex have a gender identity that doesn't match their body. And the only way to support someone struggling with their gender identity or their birth sex is to affirm them, which means literally agreeing that they're a different gender. This approach also usually comes with a long list of jargon and language rules, which obscure reality and make it impossible for the patient or their parents to make truly informed decisions about the interventions being recommended. For example, upon first meeting a child, The gender therapist will usually use the child's new cross-sex name and cross-sex pronouns and encourage the parents to do the same. The therapist will confirm that a female child, for example, is actually a boy. Again, this obscures reality and further entrenches the young person in their confusion about what's real and what's not real. Honestly, I wouldn't believe the stories myself about gender clinics and gender therapists if I had not heard them over and over and over again from parents all over the country and the world, and if I hadn't seen so many records in my work as an expert witness. These clinicians, unfortunately, encourage rapid medicalization. They make parents believe that time is running out, so they have to act now. And they use the threat of suicide and self-harm to encourage jumping right into puberty blockers, which they claim is just pushing the pause button. They ignore or downplay the risks involved with these medications by often saying that they're reversible, and they tend to underestimate the unknowns. These are not normal medical or psychological institutions. Actually, they're operating ideologically based on a lot of confusing misinformation. For more about this, I recommend looking at whistleblower accounts like Jamie Reed's here in the US or Sarah Stockton's, or take a look at the book by Hannah Barnes, who's a journalist who wrote about the Tavistock Gids Clinic in the UK. Her book is called Time to Think. I'll include those resources below as well. And another good source of information about gender clinics and gender therapists comes from detransitioners. There are plentiful number of detransitioner accounts online now. There are new people sharing their stories every day. And we've also interviewed several detransitioners on our podcast, Gender A Wider Lens, and we'll be adding more next season. For parents who were already misled by gender clinics or gender therapists and have been transitioning their child, you'll really want to hear about principle number 9, which is assertively lead your child out of gender identity and back towards reality. Go to the YouTube video description below to find the link to my private parent membership group on Subscribestar, where you can watch the rest of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.